2013's Star Trek for the Xbox 360 is a game that has a less than stellar reputation. Not only is it based on the divisive rebooted Kelvin timeline from the 2009 movie, but it is also notorious for its bugs, technical shortcomings, and perceived lack of imagination. The question is, though, did it launch with a breached warp core, or is it defiant of the critics? This is Chris from Makopowered, and welcome to Weekend Rental, where we look at games that, while not widely considered classics, or sometimes even good, are still worth examining and maybe even playing despite themselves. So, full disclosure, while I had always planned to make a video on this game, my hand was kind of forced at this point, in the best way possible. See, Steadysphere, who narrated the Covert Ops Chase the Express video, is celebrating his 5th anniversary on YouTube. As a way of celebrating, he asked friends of the channel to select games for him to review, and I was one of the lucky ones chosen. My pick was, well, 2013 Star Trek, which he reviewed for the PS3. However, because I wouldn't ask him to do something I wouldn't do myself, I figured it was only fair if I looked at the game at the same time. I just happened to have an Xbox 360 copy. So, happy 5th anniversary, Steadysphere! We both get to play through this. Just not together. I'm pretty sure the servers for online co-op have long since been pulled down. This is also why I didn't ask Velvet back to guest narrate. I do plan to ask them back for another Star Trek video, just not this one. My apologies, Velvet. Also, let's get this out of the way right now. Massive spoiler alert warning, because we are going to be discussing not only the plot and events of the game, but also those of the 2009 reboot film, the follow-up sequel Into Darkness, and 2016's Star Trek Beyond. This is important because it plays into both the examination of the game and its development, so you've been warned. The reason why I say the spoilers play into the game's development is because, despite the litany of issues, and there are a litany of issues which we will discuss presently, the game was in development for over 3 years. It started right after the success of the 2009 film. Well, okay, sort of. See, while there was planning of the game for over 3 years, there was no actual concrete coding or programming done. It also looks like there was significant turmoil in terms of leadership within Paramount Digital Entertainment, the initial main developers of the game. Original president Tom Lazinski was fired in 2011, with the reins handed over to Brian Miller. Miller, for his part, was given only 18 months to get the game fully completed and pushed out the door in order to coincide with the release of Star Trek Into Darkness. At this point, despite originally wanting to fully develop it internally, it looks like Paramount Digital Entertainment brought in Digital Extremes, the studio responsible for Warframe, The Darkness 2, and Dark Sector, to get the game done. Considering what the developers were trying to do with the game, 18 months clearly was not enough time, and, let's be nice and say that compromises occurred. And again, getting this out of the way now, yes, there are a lot of technical issues with this game. A lot. Not all of them are a huge deal, though. Sure, there's texture pop-in, but you know what? That was so common on the Xbox 360 that we're not even going to count it. Then there are things like the AI partner momentarily levitating when revived, or getting hung up on geometry 10 feet away from you, or you needing to move away from a goal marker and then move back in order to get it to trigger. There are also enemies who just stand there instead of attacking or even moving, audio glitches like Kirk's thank you clip for getting a shield boost playing over the credits. No, seriously, check it out.
Thanks for the shield assist!
These are all minor glitches though, which, to be honest, I can live with. Could they have been patched out? Sure. Do they break the game? Not at all. There are some that do break the game though, even if just a little. There were a couple of times where I had to exit out of the current play session and reload a checkpoint because either my AI partner or an NPC had blocked me into a dead end, and nothing I did was able to get them to move, so I couldn't get out, basically soft locking the game. A similar situation also cropped up, except it wasn't another character, but me just jumping up and getting stuck in the air. Then there was one area of the game where the floor killed me. No, really, the floor. Just a small patch of it for some reason. I tested it out multiple times because, at first, I thought an enemy had gotten a lucky shot off or something, but nope, death by floor. Here's the thing though, the game is generous enough with checkpoints and item pickups that even these more severe bugs didn't hugely impact my playthrough of the game. Yeah, they were frustrating, but only momentarily and not on a level that made me want to stop playing. Oh, before we move on, we should mention the bugs that actually showed up in the cutscenes, which is the clearest indication that the devs were rushed when making the game. Let's take the first encounter with the first member of the villainous race for the game, the Gorn. Now, when I first hit this cutscene, I saw the lack of proper texture on the Gorn model, and my reaction was just, oh my. Okay, well Mass Effect had some issues with texture popping on models during cutscenes, so it's fine. Except the texture never popped in. That's it. That's the texture they went with for their first big reveal of the antagonists of the game. I know this because I died fighting this guy a few times, and each time when the cutscene replayed, the same texture quality was there. Admittedly, this was something of an isolated incident, but it was also maybe the worst possible point to have that happen because it not only broke immersion, but also the tension the game was building up to that point. There are also several points where the targeting node was, just left in? It's clearly visible in multiple cutscenes, and again, while not game-breaking, is distracting and kinda drains the dramatic effect of the cutscenes where it shows up. I kind of understand why this happened. The cutscenes use the in-game engine after all, but it still sticks out nonetheless. The really interesting thing, well, interesting I guess, is that in his review of the PS3 version of the game, Steady Sphere had a list of bugs that I did not encounter. We're both chalking it up to the PS3's architecture being more difficult to work with, hence a compromised port. The thing is, when it's already a compromised game like this, a compromised port is so much worse. Oh, also of note, when I first started playing the 360 game, the usual patch notification and prompt did not come up. In other words, either any patches for the game had been taken down by this point, or there were never any patches for the game to begin with. Which, yikes. Okay, so there are a lot of bugs in the game, but nothing absolutely game-breaking. What about the game itself? Does it offer a proper Star Trek experience? Well, yes and no. Outside of maybe the Elite Force games, which were built on the Quake 3 engine, and it shows, this is definitely the most action-packed official Star Trek game. You know what? That's fine. It fits with the Kelvin Timeline movies' more action-oriented style. The only thing is that the action in the game is not unique to Star Trek. At all. The core of the gameplay boils down to third-person cover-based shooter gameplay,
which was the style at the time.
And the devs weren't shy about name-dropping their inspirations. Or most of them, at any rate. They were quite open about explicitly mentioning Gears of War, Uncharted, and, in particular, Mass Effect. Which, this game is definitely not Mass Effect. To be fair, that wasn't what they were trying for, because they didn't want to make an RPG, even if it would have been cool if they had gone all out with it, but again, 18 months. And Miller was upfront in saying that in the period leading up to the game's release. The thing is, even if third-person cover-based shooters were commonplace by that point, there were some questionable choices made in regard to Star Trek's mechanics. With most shooters of this type, moving from cover to cover is a simple button press. It's quick, it's functional, and it both keeps up the flow of combat and doesn't leave the player as a sitting duck. Not here though. In order to do most things in the game, the player needs to press and hold a button until a progress bar fills, opening a hatchway to bypass a patrol, climbing a ladder, and, most damaging, moving from cover to cover. There is a delay where the player cannot do anything because they're holding the button to move to the next piece of cover, a delay that the enemies can and will take advantage of. Sure, it's only a short delay, but when you're running low on health and trying to maneuver to a more advantageous position so you can regenerate your shields, it is 100% a difference maker. The rest of the combat mechanics, however, should feel almost immediately recognizable if you're even passingly familiar with other shooters from this generation of consoles. There are lots of random medium-height barriers to take cover behind, some of which you can actually make pop up using your tricorder. You can either shoot without aiming or pop your head up from cover, risking your own health to better try to take down an enemy. All of the weapons have a secondary fire mode. There are grenades of various sorts. When Miller said that Gears of War and Mass Effect were influences on the game, he was putting it mildly. That doesn't mean it doesn't play like a Star Trek game. At the very least, that doesn't mean you can't play it like a Star Trek game, rather. Let me explain. So the phaser, like all of the weapons in the game, has a secondary fire mode. Here, the secondary fire is the stun setting, which, You know what? That absolutely makes sense. I am totally on board with that. If you look at the phasers in the first movie, they literally switch muzzles when switching between stun and kill settings, so having that be the alternate fire is perfect here. More than that, the stun setting is instrumental to gameplay in certain sections. While still optional, it is important for the player to stun any friendly characters, Vulcan scientists, Starfleet crew members, and so on, who have been infected. We'll get to that in a moment, and are violently lashing out beyond their control. After stunning them, you can run up to them and knock them out, taking them out non-lethally. The thing is, you can do this with most of the enemies in the game. As I was playing, I found it, let's phrase it, unbecoming of a Starfleet officer to be racking up a massive body count. Because of this, I tried to stun and knock out as many enemies as possible. I even got the non-lethal master achievement for avoiding killing enemies. There are only 2 points of frustration in this regard. 1, there are some enemies where the stun does not have an effect and the player is forced to kill. 2, the game warns the player in the beginning that killing an infected character is an undesired outcome, but doesn't offer any explanation on how to stun and non-lethally take down enemies until about halfway through the game. In other words, I wound up killing that first enemy without wanting to before figuring out, for myself, what the secondary fire mode for the phaser was and going forward from there. Also, let's go back to the tricorder mentioned earlier, because while it too highlights game mechanics that are nowhere near original, those mechanics work much better in the context of the Star Trek mythos. Not functionally, mind you, there are still bugs aplenty, just in terms of the overall Star Trek experience. One of the major functions of the tricorder is detection. It detects life forms, usually hostile, and their alertness level, devices which can either be activated or hacked, which is also done through the tricorder, connections between devices and their control panels or power sources, and so on. In other words, it is lifted directly from Batman's detective vision in the Arkham games. The thing is, assigning those functions to the tricorder makes so much more sense than Batman's detective vision. With Batman, it was supposed to approximate the years of training and experience Batman brings to his exploits for the player. That's not how he actually sees the world, and it isn't him looking through lenses or anything. It's just an overlay because players are not and cannot actually be Batman. Here, though, the tricorder has legitimately demonstrated all of those functions at various points across the various iterations of Star Trek. In other words, it makes sense from a concrete world-building perspective. The other thing the tricorder does is scan objects for information and backstory. This is a mechanic lifted from so many other games. Metroid Prime, Resident Evil Revelations, the Batman Arkham games, Mass Effect, and more. Again though, it fits here because that's what the tricorder does. That is its main function. Scan life forms, structures, environments, and so on, and has been since it was introduced in the 60s TV series. So yeah, the mechanic isn't the most original, but at the same time, every game that uses a scanning mechanic owes a debt to Star Trek for it, so it is very much forgivable. There is one major aspect to the mechanics which I haven't talked about yet, but it is key not just to combat, but to the entire game: the co-op. Now, full disclosure, I played this game solo with the AI taking on the role of my companion, so I cannot speak to actual proper co-op play, but it definitely feels like there's another inspiration that Miller kinda neglected to mention: Resident Evil 5. The game entirely revolves around the dynamic between Kirk and Spock, and they are pretty much inseparable throughout, with one notable exception, which we'll discuss in a minute, and even then, it's not like they're truly separated. This dynamic does fit for the characters, especially in the Kelvin timeline, which is important because this game is canon to that timeline. In fact, the third-person co-op shooter gameplay pretty accurately resembles the scene from the 2009 movie, where Kirk and Spock beam aboard Nero's ship in order to rescue Captain Pike. This scene is likely where the devs saw the Uncharted similarities as well, since the environmental climbing sequences in the game feel both like an attempt at Uncharted and an attempt to capture the feeling of that scene. This all makes sense as the game takes place between the 2009 movie and 2013's Into Darkness, and shows the developing friendship and camaraderie between Kirk and Spock, with some of McCoy's cantankerous banter thrown in as well. That the Kirk-Spock dynamic has existed in the franchise since the 60s, though, means that giving the game that setup works even better. Well, narratively. As with everything else in the game, there are issues to be found here. For my playthrough, I played as Kirk, so the computer took Spock's role, and the RE5 vibes were immediately apparent, for good and ill. You cannot take a turbo lift without your partner nearby, nor can you leave certain areas without him. Cooperation is required to pry open the many damaged doors throughout the game. They even worked co-op into some of the hacking games, with both characters needing to work together to hit the correct override frequency for whatever system they're trying to access or take control of. All the while, both characters banter and support each other with boosts, revives when downed in combat, and more. To be fair to Star Trek, it also manages to avoid some of the pitfalls that RE5 fell into. There are no healing items, instead going for the Gears of War, Mass Effect, Halo style of regenerating shields and healing stations interspersed at set intervals. This means that there is no worry over the AI wasting healing items if you're not at max health all the time. The player also does not need to worry about their AI partner's ammo or items, which reduces the frustration in that regard too. However, there are issues which arise from this setup, which the devs refer to charmingly as bro-op. For one, there are stealth sections in the game which, while not mandatory, can make certain areas much easier. The problem here is that sometimes the AI partner can be spotted, but other times won't be. I don't mean that the AI partner has inconsistent stealth skills, although there is that. I mean that sometimes the game acts like The Last of Us, where Ellie could be in full view, but because she wasn't the player character, the enemy AI ignores her. Same deal here. Sometimes. Other times, the AI partner is treated like a player character and will get the player spotted, and you are never sure which you're going to get at a given time. As well, if you fall in combat, you need to rely on your partner to revive you, and the AI isn't exactly the smartest in this regard. There were times where the AI just completely ignored me as I was waiting for a revive, or got stuck on level geometry, or would take too long because the pathing wasn't ideal. The most common problem, though, is that if you are downed, the AI partner will likely walk into the same danger that took you out and will get taken down too. The Resident Evil 5 influence doesn't just apply to game mechanics, though. The opening act of the game carries an almost survival horror feel to it. The Enterprise is called to New Vulcan. Remember, Nero destroyed the planet Vulcan in the 2009 movie because they've received a distress call from a space station using a MacGuffin to harvest the power of a binary star in service to the settlement of the New Vulcan homeworld. They quickly find that the members of the station crew have been infected with an unknown pathogen which makes them unable to control their actions, making them irrationally violent. Kirk and Spock need to make their way through the station, fighting off infected crew members and trying to repair the station's systems before it plunges into the binary star. A remote location, an infection that makes the locals violently hostile, trying to survive with a co-op partner. This part of the game definitely feels like a direct, homage to RE5. Even the big set piece of this section, moving from cover to cover as the shields protecting the station from the binary star intermittently fail, feels like a pastiche on the worship area in the ruins in Chapter 4-2 of Resident Evil 5. This isn't a bad thing though, not the least of which because it sets aside the racism of RE5. Yeah, I said it. The eerie setting, the tension which mounts as you move through the station trying to figure out what went wrong, the growing certainty that there is more to the situation than just a malfunction or pathogen outbreak, all of it offers the notion of a Star Trek horror game, which I would be absolutely on board for. Even the initial reveal of the Gorn plays into this horror game feeling. The first encounter with a member of the Gorn, which again should have been a crescendo, but the technical issues undercut it, still plays out like a monster encounter. The fight is more difficult than anything you've encountered to that point, and you're still not sure if the creature is intelligent or another victim of the pathogen. Well, unless you're familiar with Star Trek. Sort of. Maybe. Okay, let's get our hardcore Trekker gear on here because we are about to get super nerdy. See, the Gorn have only shown up on camera in Star Trek 3 times. Most famously debuting in the original series episode Arena, in the animated series episode The Time Trap, and in the Enterprise episode In a Mirror Darkly Part 2. Despite that, their nature had been pretty firmly established, largely thanks to that initial appearance in Arena. Sure, they attacked an Earth colony in that episode, but that was because, as a species, they are fiercely territorial and saw that colony as encroaching on their domain. And yeah, they are fiercely territorial, but they aren't expansionist. They maintain their borders, but don't want to expand them. Not here, though. Here, the Gorn are the conquerors of their galaxy, enslaving or exterminating every alien race they come into contact with, which, in a really cool touch, is revealed via an interactive mind meld segment between Spock and a Gorn lieutenant. They arrived in our galaxy because the MacGuffin from the space station, in addition to harvesting energy from the binary star, also opened tears or portals to other locations in the universe. More specifically, they opened tears into the Gorn's galaxy. And the Gorn, well, they're the Covenant from Halo. Quite literally. At one point, one of the Gorn warriors used the same sound clip as a Covenant elite from the Halo games. Anyway, as I was playing, I kept hoping for some twist to keep them from being a one-dimensional villain race, but nope. Their only motivation is domination and expansion, a far cry from their nature outside the Kelvin timeline. On that note, we need to talk about those races the Gorn have enslaved, because the player encounters them on the Gorn homeworld, which is actually kind of an issue. I don't mean in any sort of gameplay sense, for once, but in terms of character and narrative. So, Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Sulu encounter these enslaved races, which prove themselves friendly, or at the very least non-hostile to the Federation. And everybody from the Enterprise just leaves them enslaved? What? I mean, it's not like the Prime Directive is preventing action here. The Gorn aren't a primitive species. They're a galaxy-conquering race. There is no way Kirk would be comfortable leaving entire civilizations enslaved like this, but the game ends with everyone acting like preventing the Gorn from entering Federation space is the best possible outcome. Sure, part of that prevention entailed eliminating the Gorn commander, but that doesn't automatically free the enslaved races under the Gorn's rule. This is particularly disappointing because there are hints in the plot which suggest that it could have been the case that the Gorn were misunderstood adversaries. One of the things the game maintains from the movies is their healthy distrust of military leaders. It is one of the key plot points of Into Darkness, with Admiral Marcus amassing a secret war fleet in order to attack the Klingon Empire and trying to instigate war between the Klingons and the Federation. In Star Trek Beyond, Krall/Balthazar Edison was a pre-Federation military leader who is trying to once again instigate war with the Federation. Here the player is presented with Commodore Daniels, who sees the MacGuffin from the space station as a potential weapon to assert the Federation's dominance. Because of Daniels' presence and motives, the entire time I was playing, I was hoping for some sort of plot twist where it turned out that the Gorn were not the invading menace they were being depicted as, but the victims of Daniels' ambition, and the attacks were them defending their territory in the face of Daniels' assault. Sadly, no though. The Gorn are exactly what they appear to be, and Daniels gets killed in one of their dungeons. It's a missed opportunity to have a plot which bridges the bombast of the Kelvin timeline movies with the more thoughtful encounter presented in the original Arena episode. On the plus side, using the Gorn did give us quite possibly the best Star Trek ad ever made though.
You keep getting me killed. I thought you had my back. Oh, not again. Hold on just a minute. Okay. No, we're both too old for this kind of thing.
Star Trek, the video game.
All right, now you're overacting.
Oh, speaking of missed opportunities, we also have to talk about the brief segment where the player is given control of the Enterprise, because I really don't know what they were trying to do here. So before following the Gorn back through the rift into their home solar system, the player needs to fend off an all-out assault on the Enterprise and is given control of the ship. Sort of. See, this segment plays out like controlling a turret. You have to protect the Enterprise from incoming Gorn projectiles, but you only have control of the weapon systems despite the audio cues clearly indicating that you are still Kirk giving orders to the bridge crew. This means that the ship just sits there while you're trying to shoot down the attacks around you, and just why? The engines aren't damaged. The sequences directly preceding and following that clearly show that the Enterprise can move, so why are there no evasive maneuvers on Sulu's part? There is no way that Sulu, Chekhov, or Kirk would just let the Enterprise sit there and let the Gorn take pot shots at her. This just feels like the devs neared the end of development and went, oh crap, we need to let the player control the ship at some point, don't we? Which is odd considering just how many references, nods, and in-jokes are littered throughout the game. First things first, the entire main cast for the films is present in the game. Chris Pine and Zachary Quinto are obviously present, but Carl Urban nails it as McCoy, again. John Cho is at the helm as Sulu. Simon Pegg is taking clear delight at not just playing Scotty, but playing Scotty in a Star Trek video game. Anton Yelchin, rest in peace, becomes an erstwhile companion character for a segment as Chekhov. And Zoe Saldana is even here as Uhura, even though you can tell that she was pressed for time because she was filming Guardians of the Galaxy at the same time. Then there are things like the fact that the game's sort of collectible consists of tribbles which are littered throughout the Enterprise. The Gorn champion the player fights in the arena on the Gorn homeworld looks like the Gorn from the episode Arena, which, okay, I see what you did there, devs. Well played. In that same arena, when Spock gets infected by the Gorn pathogen and starts fighting Kirk, it is a direct homage to the 60s series episode Amok Time, not just because Kirk and Spock fight, but because the fight is ended by McCoy's medical intervention. Oh, and the entire game opens with Kirk and Spock playing three-dimensional chess, paralleling the opening of the episode where no man has gone before, complete with their game being interrupted by an emergency distress signal. On top of that, the game expands on aspects of the Star Trek mythos as well. There is a lengthy section which shows what the turbolift tubes actually look like and how turbolifts are able to move along horizontal and vertical axes without shifting their occupants. Large sections of the Enterprise are also explorable by the player, from engineering to common areas, to the approach to the bridge, to the shuttle bays. Quite frankly, this game might have the most and the most varied areas of the Enterprise ever available to players in a Star Trek game. Not even the point-and-click games from Interplay offered more than the bridge and transporter room. Star Trek's gameplay cannot be called unique by any stretch of the imagination, and it is riddled with bugs and technical issues. However, the fact that it still manages to feel of a piece with the Kelvin Timeline movies shows a great deal of love for the franchise as a whole, and nails the minute-to-minute characterization for the main cast, make the experience feel undeniably Star Trek in nature. You do still travel to strange new worlds, seek out, and shoot, new life and new civilizations, and boldly go where no one, like QA apparently, has gone before. It may have its problems, but there is still enough here to make for a good weekend rental. Just play the 360 version, not the PS3 one. Right, Steady Sphere?
Resident Evil.